if we only frame responsibility in terms of rich consumers and rich people and how they spend their money, we don't pay any attention to how they make their money. And it's that activity that could have way more carbon impact, way more climate impact. So again, if you have a CEO of a fossil fuel industry, they could be a vegetarian. They could take public transit. They could live in a dense urban, and they would have very low carbon footprint. But all of us would agree that they're horribly responsible for climate change because of their role as an owner. And they spend more of their life as an owner organizing a global network of fossil fuel extraction across the world than they do as, you know, even if they're a bad consumer, if they spend like an hour eating a steak or driving an SUV, that's a drop in the bucket compared to their role as a capitalist.
Thank you for joining me again, Professor. I'm joined today by Professor Matt Huber, a professor of geography at the University of Syracuse in the United States. And Professor, you've recently written a book, which is right here, which I won't move just for the sake of making sure the product placement is kept nicely, but it's called Climate Change as Class War: Building Socialism on a Warming Planet, which is a very sticky title, as a few would say. And there's a few things in the title, obviously, apart from the very the red writing on the black cover, which is very stark. And as an Australian that's gone through bushfires, it really rings true of the essence, or what are the catastrophes that are looming in the light of climate change, but also as well how you reintroduce, or what I would like to think reintroduce, the topics of leftist politics, socialism, Marxism, which I'm not super familiar with, and yet I see it as being used as a politically loaded term by certain political forces in what I perceive to be modern media. So I'm very keen to sort of get an understanding of leftist politics in a very conventional sense and how it will be applied to climate change. But to start with, I would be interested, Professor, how did you arrive on writing the book? And sort of what is the story of the book, and what were your motivations for writing it?
Yeah, so as I've thought about it since it was published, I realized that a lot of things converged for me in the year 2015 that I think led to the book. The first most important thing is I became a father for the first time. I had a child, and it's almost cliche at this point, but many people point out that when you have a child, the climate crisis just becomes that much more real. I was contemplating my daughter reaching retirement age in the year 2080 and thinking about what the world and planet will look like for her at that stage, and just it's quite terrifying. And so I felt a kind of urgency. And to be honest, the book is a bit polemical, and I say I approached writing it from a source of kind of anger and frustration, because I feel like we've known about climate change for decades. We've had all the science clear, and yet we've been sort of unable politically to mount any sort of substantial response to it year after year. So that the book is kind of coming from this frustration from the lack of real substantial political action. But some other things were happening in 2015. I was also teaching Marx's Capital. You know, it's this big book, Capital Volume 1. And it really hit me that book, just very briefly for your audience, really kind of starts off with an analysis of commodities and exchange and market relations. And then in the book, it takes this really important shift where it says, if we really want to understand where profit comes from and how capitalists make these profits, we have to shift from the market to what he calls the hidden abode of production. We have to go into the sites of production to see this kind of brutal, naked form of power and the ways that capitalists exploit workers in factories, in production zones. And at that same time, you know, in 2015, most of the discussion of what we're going to do to solve the climate crisis was very much about markets and exchange, and we're going to get the prices right by internalizing the cost of emissions into the prices, and we're going to do carbon pricing, and we're going to solve this thing through exchange relations. And it really struck me that actually, when you look at climate change through the lens of production, you go and you look at actually huge industrial facilities, like I cover in the book, like nitrogen fertilizer production. Like there's just utter disregard and indifference toward the consequences of climate change from their perspective, of the people who profit from an organized production in this way. And then finally, perhaps most importantly, in 2015, an old socialist from Vermont decided to run for president, Bernie Sanders, and it really catapulted socialism and socialist politics onto the scene in the United States, like how it just had not been the case in any significant way in my entire lifetime. So I came of age in kind of the classic sort of neoliberal period where right-wing politics was ascendant, and there was no sort of sense that the left had a real alternative for capitalism. It was Margaret Thatcher's era of there is no alternative, and markets and capitalism were triumphant. And I was, doing what's called Marxist geography. We would read our David Harvey and read Capital and come up with a very sophisticated analysis of capitalism and its problems and critiques of capitalism. But still, even in my academic field, there wasn't much discussion of what we want instead of capitalism, and discussions of an actual socialist politics. And so I became much more interested in trying to think about, well, what would a socialist climate politics look like, and how can we kind of sort of propose an alternative economic model to deal with the crisis.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, congratulations on being a father, and I commend you for writing this book out of a sense of frustration. As I guess, on the border of being a millennial, but being a Gen Z person, I think it's very encouraging to see people of academic rigor, as well as people that have an authority to speak on things, using that in the best possible capacity in order to fight climate change. And that's something I've sort of observed at the university I've attended, and even in the workplaces that I've attended, that the political will of academics, of career professionals is very hard to gain in order to fight climate, because of all sorts of reasons. But I think more practical reasons, that people are focused on the task on hand, which is their job. And it's very hard to sort of motivate and mobilize, especially if certain forces are sort of pushing you in other directors, or you have certain incentives. But to sort of focus on a few things that you've mentioned. So I know there was a book I read recently by John Monbiot, the Guardian writer, and it's a book called Politics in the Age of Reckoning. And he sort of constructs this meta narrative of the past 100 years or so, where he sort of traces from the 40s, 50s to 60s to like Keynesian economics, whereby you're using high taxes from the rich to sort of to help society be more equitable, and then neoliberal age. And then he points out that after the GFC in the 2008, where there would usually be a swing in political narratives or political economic thought, or even just a greater political thought, there wasn't a alternative narrative at the time that was feasible, which I think would be interested to get your take on. But I thought, as overall, it rung very true to me that there hadn't been a viable alternative. And I suppose that's when you say people like Bernie Sanders, and I think even people that are running off the back of his campaign. I think there's quite a young bloke in America who, I think he was elected in Florida in the recent election, who's only 25, and he's sort of running on a similar Marxist campaign. But I think that's quite interesting. And it'd be interesting to see diving into Marxist thought as well as Marxist geography, which seems very niche and super, super interesting. But just before that, I think it'd be good now to just get a sense of the thesis of your book. So it's called Climate Change as Class Warfare. Why class warfare in particular? Perhaps for those that are not familiar with Marxist thought and have only heard it as a sort of ad hominem attack, if you could introduce people to the fundamental theory of
Yeah.
of Marxism, or how it ties into your book in particular?
Yeah. So they, it basically, the idea that climate change is a problem of class inequality is actually pretty common sort of analysis that many non-Marxist researchers have pointed out. There was a famous report by Oxfam that is called Extreme Carbon Inequality, and that shows, the top 10% of the world, the richest people are responsible for about 50% of emissions, and obviously the poorest are least responsible. Thomas Piketty, the sort of famed economist of inequality, has done similar analyses of kind of the inequality of carbon footprints and relationships. But what I was sort of seen from those types of analyses is all their focus is on the role of rich people spending money and consumption on cars and flying and meat and whatever, and then attributing emissions and responsibility to those what are called consumption-based footprints. And this is just the sort of standard way in which carbon responsibility is analyzed and thought about. So the vision of class from that perspective is purely just focusing on people's income and their consumption and lifestyle practices. But a Marxist theory of class is extremely different. It really has not very much to do with consumption at all. It has to do with basically what you own and what you control to generate the money that you use to consume later. And it's classically defined as what is your relationship to the means of production, right? And so there's a small group in society that really lives off the ownership of capital or property, who own and control production systems. You could think of like a CEO of a fossil fuel company, or I profile the fertilizer industry. And so those people who are owners, they're a very small minority of society. And then the rest of society is all they own really is their labor power, their capacity to work, and they sell that on a market for a wage or a salary. And so that's the vast majority of society under capitalism, is people that don't own really much but their capacities to work, and they survive through selling those capacities for a wage. And so what I sort of discovered is that when you shift your class analysis towards this kind of Marxist focus of ownership and production and profit, you come to really different conclusions about who's responsible for the crisis. I mean, one thing we could point out is that the very idea of a carbon footprint linked to people's individual consumption actions was invented by British Petroleum. So the companies who own production, who profit off production, they're tweeting out these carbon footprint calculators, asking people to learn how they can help with climate change individually. And so they are very keen on spreading this narrative that responsibility is really diffuse. It's all of us and our diffuse kind of consumption behaviors that are responsible. But there's another just basic ways of looking at this that, when you are a consumer and you say you drive a car and you're emitting carbon, should you actually be 100% responsible for those emissions when there are other capitalists who have sold you that fuel, who sold you the car, who sold you the tires? They're making money and profits off that exchange relationship. And so therefore, this carbon footprint method of attributing responsibility just erases the role of these, what I call profiteers, who actually profit off these relationships, the owners and so forth. And then the final thing is that if we only frame responsibility in terms of rich consumers and rich people and how they spend their money, we don't pay any attention to how they make their money. And it's that activity that could have way more carbon impact, way more climate impact. So again, if you have a CEO of a fossil fuel industry, they could be a vegetarian, they could take public transit, they could live in a dense urban, and they would have very low carbon footprint, but all of us would agree that they're horribly responsible for climate change because of their role as an owner. And they spend more of their life as an owner organizing a global network of fossil fuel extraction across the world than they do as, even if they're a bad consumer, if they spend like an hour eating a steak or driving an SUV, that's a drop in the bucket compared to their role as a capitalist. And so really this whole narrative of carbon inequality is really erasing the role of owners and capitalists in production. And so I felt like it was really useful to take this lens towards that. And then we'll talk more about it, I'm sure. But I also sort of noticed that the people driving climate politics and advocacy also come from a particular kind of class of people in our capitalist society, and I categorize them as professional class people that sort of are highly educated and might work in science or academia or non-governmental organizations. And then finally, like classic Marxist politics is really trying to build a broad-based unified working class politics that tries to channel kind of the majority of society that again doesn't own much. They have to work in very low wage, precarious types of occupations. And it's Marxist theory that it's really the working class that has real power in a capitalist society that no other force really has. And so therefore, like trying to think about how to channel that power that the working class has toward climate solutions seemed like a useful way to kind of take this Marxist class theory to the climate crisis.
Absolutely. I mean, you've said a lot there, Matt. So maybe just to focus on a few things. I think as a very actively engaged consumer in terms of wanting to purchase the right things, doing the right things, I think it can almost liberate all of us who are active climate consumers, I guess, to use the phrasing, to focus not only on the ways that we can avoid purchasing or moving our political capital to businesses or to services that are maybe not feasible for long-term environmental use, but also focusing on the root solutions. So obviously there's a theory of thought called systems thinking, whereby you examine the whole system. And to me, it seems that what I would characterize, and perhaps you would characterize it slightly different, but a deliberate obfuscation of what is truly important in the climate crisis, which is focusing on the people that have the political power to actually change how a system operates, even if it impacts the bottom line. And this is of particular interest to me as a business student / graduate who in traditional business schools, it's still taught today that the bottom line is that you need to increase the value of the shareholders. That's it. And ESG is taught now, and all these sorts of fairy greenwash terms. But at the end of the day, it doesn't mean anything, because if the underlying principle is shareholder value, then companies that cement companies and steel companies, for example, which I think contribute around 15% of emissions, they will continue to do business as usual, and they won't change. And so I think a focus on the production side I find is very liberating from a consumer perspective, but it's also a big relief as well, because it is if to use a metaphor, it's almost like we're in a big Western film, and there's those two characters that are about to go for the holster and the gun in the holster, and one of them wins, but only to find out that the person they've shot is in effect not the right person. We're focusing on the consumer side of things and not the production side. And there's also interesting philosophies which have sort of developed from that. So I don't know if you've come across, but there's a philosophy sort of similar to egalitarianism called limitarianism, where, similar to the idea that there shouldn't be anyone that is below a certain income level, we should also cap the maximum level of income for everyone in the world. And this is perhaps a bit more radical view, but sort of one that is shared by economists like Georgos Kallis, which I know that you have a disagreement on in Degrowth, so I'd be happy to sort of jump into that in a second. But I think that's also important on focusing on that working class and that professional class perspective. But before I jump into all those fascinating topics, I've sort of characterized the reason we've not focused on production side economics and policy is because of deliberate obfuscation. So citing books like Merchants of Doubt or The New Climate War by Michael Mann. would you characterize it as a deliberate obfuscation? Has the focus on consumer side been explicitly deliberate, or has this sort of just been the nature of how politics has played out?
Well, I think there is some deliberate nature to it. I mean, like I said, like you got British Petroleum literally coming up with the idea of a carbon footprint, spreading that narrative that, like it's up to individuals to solve the crisis. And so, but one thing I think that's interesting is, again, that Marx calls it the hidden abode of production, because it is hidden. It is sort of out of sight.
Yeah.
And particularly you mentioned, and this is, my go-to example, like steel, cement, these in many ways, like in a lot of industrialized global north countries, those are not only hidden from the neighborhood, they're offshored entirely. So they're we live in the age of global production chains. And so, and even if they are visible, they are, as Marx said, they have a sign on no admittance except on business. So they're private property. You're not allowed in. If you're a journalist, for instance, if a scientist, I was very lucky, and it's a long story, to get access to a private corporate fertilizer factory to learn what goes on in there, but that's not common for academics or journalists to get even access. So one thing I think is, particularly in the global north countries, we live in a consumer-based economy. We are living our lives in that world of consumption where we use our salary, our income, to basically acquire commodities we need to survive. And we then are provisioning our needs, right? And I think it's, as you said, like all of us try to do the right thing as consumers. And the way capitalism is we actually aren't very free in our workplaces. We have to do what the boss says. We have to basically go with whatever the owners are saying we have to do. But in our consumption world, we have some freedom, contention on how much money we have, and so we have choices, we have agency, and so there's a reason why under capitalism people put a lot of interest and effort on that side of things, because it feels like the only place where we have any kind of agency. So and so there is some sort of educational thing we can learn by our lives as consumers. But one of the points I try to make in the book is that capitalist owners, like you said, this is in training and business schools, they're not like you and me. They're not trying to provision their needs or do the right thing for the world through their choices. They have to, as a sort of fiduciary responsibility, to maximize shareholder value and to accumulate capital and grow and maximize profits. And that focus is not like you and me when we're out in consumer world, where that's very different sort of orientation. And if it happens that it's really the people that own and are profiting off various forms of production are really the ones driving the climate crisis, then unfortunately we really have to put a lot more attention on them. And sometimes I worry that all the attention we put on the consumers and people in their everyday lives is, again, helpful and educational, but it's like you said, it's like taking your eye off the real enemy or the real driver of the problem. And again, when that driver is somewhat hidden from us in our everyday lives, it's sometimes you got to do, and that's what Marx actually says, like we have to go beyond the surface of everyday life and sort of analyze what's driving the system, what's beneath the surface. And so I think that's not always self-evident to a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, even just in your descriptions of Marx, it seems like he's very prophetic, especially today. And I'm very curious as to what the actual criticisms are of Marxism and on a fundamental level, because everything you're saying it's appealing to me on a very deep level. But anyways, it definitely resonates with me in terms of the ideas of maximizing capital as a business student. And what I find particularly troubling in the language that is taught in business schools, and this is not to say this is some sort of nefarious plot, although it may be, but I don't think it is, whereby the language that is taught, particularly in finance, I don't think it is overtly training students to be capitalists, but fundamentally what happens is they come out as capitalists. And I think a really good example of this, at least in my personal life, is the field of consulting. I think as business students, consulting is sold as the apex of being a career professional. You get to graduate right out of business school with a very big salary. You go straight into the boardrooms of companies where you're solving really important problems. But I think the even the framing of it as solving important problems is the perhaps where problems begin to fester and begin to expand, where, in my view, seeing things as simply as problem solving and as a way to help make businesses money sort of distracts us from what's really important, which is, I guess, as you point out in your book, as I've understand, is fundamentally it comes down to carbon emissions. Mm-hmm. And no matter how much value you create for a business, ultimately, if every business is emitting more than it is sequestering, that is a very big problem. Mm-hmm. And no amount of public policy, or actually no, public policy can help, but if there is no public policy, businesses will continue to do as they will. And this has been a very fundamental problem in Australia, whereby the past 10 years we've had a government who have delayed climate change. And in 2013, our prime minister was actually a climate denier, very, very explicitly so. And as a result, our emissions were pretty well, they were going down, but very, very nominally so. And they even dismantled a carbon tax. So Australia's government is the first government to actually dismantle a carbon tax, which is not a very good legacy. But the new government, which is a Labor government, is taking big strides in sort of restoring that, but sort of observing that dynamic whereby the private sector is sort of taking lead and the people itself are taking lead, I find to be optimistic. And maybe as a Marxist, you would agree that it's the people where power lies, and that's where action truly happens. But you touched on professional classes. I'm what you would call a professional class now. I work a full-time job in an office, and it's been very interesting observing the dynamics and the roadblocks, you would say, preventing action. I'm on my company's sustainability group, participate in all these sorts of things, and yet I feel very frustrated and angry because of the lack of material action, I would say. But that's not only shared by my company, that is, and to be fair, my company is leading in many ways. And yet, I think in the whole scope of climate, as you point out, if emissions is, what is it, 420 parts per million at the moment, which is, or something like that, which is incredibly significant. If it's only going up, it's a problem. So how does professional class tie into climate change, and how does the working class tie into that as well?
So the professional class is, I started to again notice that when you look at who are the most vocal and who are the people that are organizing and advocating around climate issues, it tended to be from a particular type of class and cultural background of highly educated people. And I define the professional class as those that marshal credentials in the labor market to carve out some sort of advantages. And I try to basically isolate two kind of ways of approaching climate politics that I think are highly appealing to professionals, or maybe I'll cover three, but that are highly appealing to professional people, but don't really have the capacity to really resonate with and appeal to the vast majority of working class people. Because even in Australia and the United States and Europe, like when you actually think about who has credentials and who has things like degrees who are able to carve out these advantages, it's a minority of the population. In the United States, something like close to 2/3 of adults do not have a college degree. And so the vast majority of people are uncredentialed, are working in very precarious, low-wage types of occupations, either in the service industry or in sort of various forms of manual labor, whereas the professional class is often working in what we call the knowledge economy, you know, working in an office, working with ideas. And that is in itself kind of also a point I make in the material sense, that they're kind of separated from the industrial production systems that are causing climate change, and they kind of approach it as from this very distanced way. But anyway, let me get to the first sort of classic way in which professional educated people approach climate change is that it's a problem of knowledge and believing the science, right? And the real and you know, it is a serious problem to have a climate denier as your leader in Australia, or we've had plenty of climate deniers. But ultimately, this kind of politics of believe science and sort of really putting science and credentials really appeals again to highly educated people, but I'm not sure it really has a huge capacity to meet everyday working people in their more material lives, where they're struggling to pay rent and things like this. You know, the yellow vest movement in France had this slogan where politicians care about the end of the world, but we're trying to meet the end of the month, right? And so they're dealing with rent and utility bills and the cost of living crisis, and this idea of like science seems very removed from that. And I argue that it really allows the right the climate deniers, to be the ones that are channeling class politics by always citing the economics of the problem. They say that, you know, these climate things like a carbon tax, it's going to raise the price of energy, it's going to cost jobs, it's going to ruin your life as a hardworking person. And this politics of science really doesn't have an answer to that class politics from that the right throws at us all the time. And even more so, the second kind of ways in which professionals will approach is that it's really a problem of policy, and that we need to design really clever technocratic policies that can solve climate change in these very complicated ways. So I talk a lot about in the book of carbon pricing and various cap and trade schemes and carbon taxes and carbon dividends and all this kind of, again, highly technocratic, highly complicated policy regimes that are, again, meant to kind of elegantly sort of create the right incentives and create the right price structure, but never really ask themselves, are we asserting a climate politics that might appeal to and be popular with the masses of working people? And again, once again, you know, it's been proven time and time again that carbon pricing is not particularly popular. You know, in the United States, they tried to pass a carbon tax in a very liberal state of Washington, and it failed by huge margins most time. It's very easy for the fossil fuel industry to organize against these carbon taxes, because they can just say it's going to make your energy cost more, and it's hard. And sometimes they try to like create these complicated, you know, redistributions of income to make it not cost more, but ultimately it's not a real easy to understand winning political message. And then the last thing I argue is that because professional class people, their ultimate class project is about sort of using credentials to obtain a kind of semblance of middle class or economic security, they often can be in sort of relatively material, comfortable circumstances. And what I argue is that's a real contradiction for climate aware, environmentally aware professional class people, because they have this comfortable lifestyle and they consume a fair amount, but they're doing so while the world is burning, and they feel this sort of guilt. I call it carbon guilt, this kind of carbon guilt about their complicity in the climate crisis. And so instead of really blaming the real people who are in power, like the owners of capital really driving this crisis, they blame themselves, and they kind of create this kind of, again, very moralistic politics about carbon footprints and lifestyle actions and lifestyle politics. And even I'm sure we'll talk about it later, I think if you look at a lot of writing on the sort of radical environmental left in terms of degrowth and stuff like that, it has traditionally focused a ton on the problem of consumerism and consumption and this mass consumer society, which again has its problems and there's critiques to be had there, but again kind of takes a lot of the eye off of the owners, the production, the thing what I would argue is really causing. And if we want to tackle the real cause, we actually have to build a politics that appeals far wider to a broader majority of society and doesn't just appeal to the highly minority, highly educated professionals who oftentimes in political advocacy kind of talk to one another and speak to one another, and they're oftentimes really preaching to their own choirs of this kind of climate moralistic politics and oftentimes I wish that people would just be a little more reflexive about the limits of their politics and how they need to build a politics that's not just so insular and inward looking, that needs to look outward towards the broader masses of working people and what their struggles are.
Yeah, well, I mean, I commend you for that fantastic analysis as I see it. I mean, on the point of credentialism and working class people, perhaps correct me if I'm wrong, Professor, but I sort of see this as a fundamental, not even a denial, maybe it is a denial, but whereby political movements are sort of presented with problems in their campaign. So, for example, I think that Donald Trump's campaign in America in 2016, the Brexit campaign in America, whereby you have vast numbers of people, particularly working class people, that have one particular viewpoint, and the professional classes have a completely different viewpoint. And the working class viewpoint wins, in a sense. So in America, Donald Trump was elected largely based on rural, as well as I think some marginal city seats. And Brexit, as I understand it, was won because of people in the country, people outside the cities, not the professional classes, but the working classes. And the analysis of the professional classes is to say, well, these people are stupid. They don't really understand it. And it is the hubris of the professional class, as I see it, to acknowledge that in order to have any sort of successful political movement, you have to unify power and not, I guess, divide, as I see it. There's a fantastic book where I highly recommend you read, if you haven't already read it, called The Tyranny of Merit by Professor Michael Sandel. And he has this analysis in his book where he paints such a vivid picture, and for those who haven't read it, essentially he argues that particularly in America, by using the example of Donald Trump's election, that it is the credential class who, by focusing on merit in a very technocratic sense, as you put it, in terms of technocratic policy, sort of it removes any color or shade from the definition of merit and reduces it to a very purely economic lens. And by doing so, it means that politics the politics has been reduced basically to economic and sort of professional class speaking points that don't really appeal to anyone outside the professional class. And so I feel very energized or very motivated by what you're saying. And at the same time, I'm also very interested in how we can get working class people on our side. I say that as if there's some sort of distant person which I have never met, which I think maybe is indicative of the problem.
Yeah, you're covering something that's not just in sort of Trump and America. It's actually a process that, again, Thomas Piketty and other researchers, political scientists have identified that in particularly Europe and I imagine in Australia too, that these parties that used to be the parties of the working class, labor parties, social democratic left parties, have seen their base shift from the working class toward these kind of affluent, highly educated voters, professionals, and that's become the base. Now, the problem for those parties, as they find, is that base is again in a minority of society, and it tends to be a highly activated minority. They vote a lot, they're very invested in politics, but it's not the majoritarian basis. And so the working class in these countries has been shifting more to the right. And again, they take a, Marxists wouldn't agree with this. They take a pretty sort of educational theory of class where, you know, non-college educated are the working class and they're the majority, and college educated or university educated are the minority professional class. But I do think there's, you know, that's a proxy for some sort of broadly Marxist version of the working class that actually, you know, again, in the United States, if 63% don't have a college degree, you can bet most of them are probably wage workers. They're probably working in pretty low wage and precarious types of circumstances. And, you know, it's not, and it's also that the working class itself is divided between these types of parties, because these center-left parties are still, like in the United States, the Democratic Party is still able to get a good amount of votes from non-college educated working class voters of color, for instance, although the 2020 elections had a lot of those people shifting in increments towards the right and towards Trump, really alarming ways. The New York Times did this analysis of urban, because we you know, like you said, we think Trump is a rural vote, but they showed that urban immigrant communities in big cities like New York, Chicago, San Francisco were shifting to Trump in droves. But anyway, for the most part, a lot of voters of color in these kind of working class categories were voting for the Democrats, whereas white working class were voting for Trump. So from a Marxist perspective, we want a unified a majority working class that's sort of all on the same page. And that's kind of, again, you were mentioning this kind of arc of history of 20th century politics. There was a time in not just the US, but many of these countries where we were able to stitch together a kind of working class politics that align with a certain kind of party infrastructure. And that's now just sort of de-aligning, right? As people call it. There's sort of this sort of de-alignment process where the working class is divided. The professionals are sort of in their little affluent enclaves, very smugly, like I mean, like they have all the right ideas and they're very smart. And like you said, that they oftentimes have these very sort of condescending ideas of the masses that are just sort of dumb and ignorant. I remember, you know, I work in academia. I remember I was with a colleague at an event, and she told me she would prefer that the masses aren't allowed to vote in our country because they're so dumb. Yeah. Just like, aren't we supposed to believe in democracy here? Yeah. So it's a real problem, but and so that's, you know, that's what I'm trying to get us to think about. How could if we have a climate politics that currently really only appeals to these highly educated minorities, what would a climate politics look like for the broader majority?
Yeah. And as I see it as well, just to add on to that, I think it pushes us towards not being lazy, us being professional classes, and thinking that if we can appeal to one sort of voting group of people, you know, people that are gone to university and go to more like traditional office jobs, or even go into academia, saying that there's actually more people to us. So it's just sort of, I guess, a point of awareness. And which seems so simple, and yet I can sort of understand why it may have taken not so simple steps to get there. I also, it just sort of, whilst you were speaking, I was just thinking about how I was sort of describing working class people as if they're sort of living on some sort of distant other planet. I was also thinking in that moment, well, it's really important to get them on board, because then we can sort of win the climate war. And then I also had another thought, well, then I'm sort of viewing them purely instrumentally. And I think that, I don't know if you would agree, is that, I imagine that is also a problem, because we need to ensure that we are truly creating the best livelihood for all, including the working class. I mean, that's sort of a given. Maybe I'm sort of feel a bit embarrassed now, but but like I sense that instrumental view is quite indicative of professional classes, or perhaps that's just
Mm.
me being a business student trying to think how I'm more, how I can turn everything into sort of a advantage. Anyway,
No,
yeah, so you go.
yeah, I mean, I think what you're mentioning is a real problem where there is this sort of cultural uh, um, chasm
Mm,
between people that do sort of end up in these highly educated, they live in the same neighborhoods, they obviously hang out in the same social networks, they're on the same social media together, so they, we talk about it as a bubble. People are in these bubbles where they don't really know there's a wider world of
mm,
people that aren't like them, right?
mm,
And so it's just a real problem. And even in the United States, we've been trying to rebuild a kind of socialist politics, and we've been doing it through particularly an organization that exploded since Trump was elected called Democratic Socialists of America. And we've found there too, the people that join the DSA, the people that come to our meetings, the people that are involved in organizing, all tend to be highly educated, although we often refer to
mm,
them as college educated, downwardly mobile people that
mm,
are saddled with a lot of student debt or working low wage jobs because they can't find a good professional class job. So,
mm,
but it's still the same type of cultural people who are sorted into this kind of socialist activism
mm,
alongside other culturally similar people. So
mm,
one way we try to deal with that is when we do campaigns, we try to make sure we go out and
mm.
it's called canvas, knock doors, and talk
Yeah,
to
yeah.
just ordinary people about the issues we're fighting for, and try to kind of understand what their concerns are and try to like listen and organize through listening. But that's a different story than just, particularly if it's an electoral campaign, just like knocking their door every couple of years to vote for this person. How to get these people and again into our organization, to get the organization itself to be of and by the larger working class. That's something the DSA has been
Mm,
not really able to figure out. It's because it's really hard. There's this gulf, there's this chasm. But I will say, I mean, you said it's instrumental to think about how do we get the working class on board. I mean, I would say it's just politics. Like we,
mm,
if we want to win politically, we have to think about how can we reach the larger masses of society. And
mm,
sure, I mean, politics is kind of instrumental. You have to just be like very means to an end, right? To win,
mm,
right? But the crazy thing to me though is that so many people in these professional class contexts aren't even asking the question about how we can reach broader audiences. They're so enveloped in these sort of silos of
mm,
advocacy and organizing that they don't think about, well, what would it mean to articulate a much broader based mass majoritarian
mm.
politics. So
Yeah, for sure. I suppose it's one of the most interesting sampling biases that you could sort of construct.
absolutely.
So there's a few things now. So I have two thoughts. So obviously we can sort of dive in more into the solutions of your book, because as I've understood and read about your book, a lot of people are sort of saying that this is sort of like a manual for leftists, or I guess people that are more Marxist leaning, on how to sort of proceed in the age of of capital and sort of in climate in particular. But even just before then, I'd be interested to know. So in Australia, we have our two parties. We have the Liberal Party, which is our, I guess, a conservative party, and then we have the Labor Party, which is our what you'd call Democratic Party in the United States. And the Labor Party, as is in the name, has historically been a very working class oriented party that focuses on unions. So Australia has a very big union movement, and focusing on more on the ground issues of everyday people. As I've seen culturally in Australia, I think the sort of shift towards the right, although we've had a conservative party being elected for the past 10 years, I don't know how. I haven't seen any research to see how big the shift has been from working class people to more right leaning parties. Um, I wonder, and obviously you were mentioning for America, that's definitely been the case. How do you appeal to these maybe voters that are formerly Labor voters, that are working class people that used to vote, I guess, more democratic or socialist, but have swung to the other side of the spectrum? How do you appeal to those people? Because to me, it seems like it is very much a like I said before, it seems that being labeled as a Marxist is now an ad hominem in certain political circles, um, and so any even utterance of the word uh, uh, leaves people like, oh, that's, I don't want to be associated with it. But obviously, it seems to be very working class centric in its sort of philosophy. So how do you appeal to those to working class people?
Yeah, I mean, it was a long time ago, but in the late 19th, early 20th century, there were Marxist oriented parties that built up mass working class support. And particularly the sort of classical example is the Social Democratic Party of Germany. And they had a huge base of working class support. And the theory is, I'm probably dumbing it down and simplifying it, but it's basically this idea that under capitalism, the vast majority of working class people are highly exploited by capital, and they have a material interest in gaining more secure access to the basics of a good life. And so the idea is that politically you want to make sure to appeal to the material interest of the broader working class when you arrange your politics. And in the early Marxist labor parties, they fought for a revolution in an abstract sense, but they also fought for like shortening the working day. They fought for laws that would make workplaces safer for workers and things like this, and which so they appeal to the direct kind of material interest. So what I argue in the book is that when we talk about what are the material interest of workers under capitalism, I tried to point out that what defines the working class under capitalism from an ecological standpoint is that they're torn from any ecological guarantee of their life. And Marx actually tells the history of capitalism as tearing the majority from the land in a process he describes as proletarianization, sort of tearing people from a direct subsistence relationship to the land and forcing them to then, as a matter of survival, to have to sell their labor power for a wage to capital, who then exploits them. And so this sort of severing of the people from ecology and from the means of life itself creates a fundamental insecurity for the mass of the working class to just obtain the basics of life. Again, those end of month struggles that the yellow vests are talking about, paying rent, paying for your utilities, for your energy. This is exhausting. It's stressful. It's a real struggle to just make ends meet in under capitalism. And so what I argue is that a broader working class climate politics would just try to appeal to those basic material needs that people face every day. So, and the convenient thing is that many of the sectors that we need to aggressively decarbonize, basically energy, transportation, housing, food and agriculture, all these things are the core basic material needs of working class people. And so when we think about building a climate politics and a climate program that would be about giving people secure access to those basic needs, under the banner of climate and decarbonization of those sectors at the same time, then you might have something that could really appeal to and reach those people. And again, it wouldn't have to be about even believing the science, or it wouldn't have to be about this kind of moralistic politics of reducing your carbon footprint. And it would just appeal to people's struggles and materially to survive under a really increasingly barbaric capitalist system. And so, but of course, this was sort of the idea of a Green New Deal, of trying to kind of combine the crisis of inequality with the crisis of climate change and build a kind of climate politics that did offer these kind of material gains. The problem is that if you don't win that kind of program into power and start delivering material gains under the banner of climate action, you're not going to be able to sort of catalyze that theory of change into existence. And I think we
Mm,
discovered that with like the Bernie Sanders campaign and Corbynism in Britain.
mm,
That, you know, you might have a lot of cool ideas about, you know, a Green New Deal on paper, but if you don't actually win and deliver those things, you're not going to, the working class is going to
mm,
be quite cynical about your
mm,
capacity to deliver those types of promises. And, you know, my
mm,
experience knocking doors for Bernie Sanders is everyone's like, yeah, free healthcare, a Green New Deal, it sounds great. It's just never going to happen. And so you have this kind of cynicism and
yeah,
resignation.
right.
And so, unfortunately, that the history of building working class politics is not really, it's not really done through magic, through an electoral
Mm,
cycle. Like we elect Bernie Sanders and then working class politics comes back in existence. You have to do the kind of nitty gritty organizing of unions and
mm,
things like working class parties that actually have infrastructure in people's everyday lives that are folded into communities and neighborhoods. And once that infrastructure starts to win things and deliver things, you can sort of build up to a more broader electoral type of outcome. But it
mm,
takes a lot of organizing, it takes a lot of work, and it's not easy. It's very hard.
Yeah, and just on the first point you're making about sort of separating people from, I guess, ecology, and what a point I sort of realized, or perhaps you mentioned this, but it just sort of came to me now, is that um, a lot of professional classes, as I see it, they all live in urban areas. They live in cities.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest problems I'm finding, trying to sort of find my ecological, spiritual connection to the land, is that to get food, you have to go to the supermarket.
Mm-hmm.
You do not see where it comes from. You do not see the farmers that get the food for you. You have no sort of sense of connection to the food. It's purely energy. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you don't have any gardens, you don't have any forests to walk through. All the activities that you spend your time doing are either shopping, which is incredibly ecologically devastating, especially if it's an industry like fast fashion, if it's an industry like, I don't know, any other industry that's ecologically not very sustainable, which is, I think, most of them at the moment. But a realization is that professional classes, in a sense, have sort of been, I guess, slowly, their ecological connection has been severed
Yeah.
slowly but very severely, to a point now where it sort of makes sense why, or from that lens purely, why action can be delayed, because we don't really, why would we care? We completely disconnected from it.
Right.
um, but yeah, on your point of working class solutions, I completely agree about, trying to sort of come up with substantive policy and having appealing policy as the number one thing, just because, a Green New Deal, or, sort of vague notions of we're going to resolve climate aren't sort of sufficient to win working class voters who are uncredentialed, who may not have the same experiences that professional classes do. Coming to solutions now, in Australia, I think, or even in New Zealand, agriculture takes up, I think, 30 to 40% of our emissions, and then electricity, transport, and then heating are the next two really, really big players. And to me, these are really huge areas where working class solutions or Marxist solutions can really help fight against climate. And I'm wondering, we're talking about solutions, and you sort of mentioned transportation, but what are the solutions? How can socialism and Marxism help solve climate?
Yeah. So I sort of articulating what I see as a kind of two-pronged working class strategy. The first prong is what I was saying earlier, is like a big Green New Deal that invest in public investment, but also guaranteed economic rights to things like transportation. By the way, like in Boston, the mayor's was a Green New Deal mayor, and she's been trying to offer free public transportation as one of her things. These are things that can benefit and appeal to the whole working class, if you will, all of them. But that's not enough from a Marxist perspective. We need a more targeted labor strategy in a labor movement, a union strategy that's in the sectors that we need to transform. So the other part of my book sort of tries to sort of map out how we could think about really targeting a particular types of sectors to organize workers in to fight for both decarbonization, but also increased unionization and worker empowerment in those sectors. I focus a lot on electricity in the book because it's sort of the linchpin of decarbonization. You probably heard we have to really clean up electricity and then electrify other parts of the economy. And in Australia, I'm sure it's the same as the United States. It's a very unionized part of the economy already. So you have sort of already existing organization and infrastructure to build through. And so I pay a lot of attention to that. But there are, of course, unions in transportation, and public transportation. I think already public transit unions are sort of one of the most vocal allies of climate action because they want to do things like expand public transit infrastructure, which would benefit the larger working class, but also benefit those unions, benefit those workers in those unions. Agriculture is a sort of more dicey one because it's become so capital intensive and automated that there's not a lot of workers, and the workers that are in it are often some of the most exploited, disposable immigrant workers that have tried union organizing in various ways, but often struggle. Certainly there are the capacity to build organization in that sector. More broadly, I think that solving climate change, unfortunately, is going to require a lot of building of new infrastructure, new energy technologies, new public transit, new housing. And therefore, I think there's an opportunity to really get on board all the what we call the building trades unions, all the construction unions, all the electricians, the carpenters, the people that actually do, and again, they're very culturally different from the professional class, the people that do manual labor in these trades, in these construction industries. They could be a real sort of pivot organizational force that could fight for a union-led green transition. One thing I've been really worried about and focused a lot on is that in the United States and other countries, the renewable energy industry right now is extremely not friendly towards unions, right? It's pretty much owned by Wall Street. It's very private, for-profit renewable energy developers who hire extremely transient and precarious workers to do these sort of quick installations and construction jobs that aren't really conducive to very effective union organizing. And so I think climate activists even can make a case to these unions in the electricity sector and the building trades that if you're not really organizing and thinking strategically about how to implant yourself and how to insert yourself into the energy transition, you could be really destroyed by kind of like Wall Street renewable energy capitalism that could just de-unionize a lot of the workforce. So there's a lot at stake, I think, and the key is to try to get the organizational power of workers and unions fighting for both their jobs and their members, but also for a big sort of investment regime of decarbonization.
In one of our recent state elections, not the state I'm in, but the state of Victoria, which the capital is the city of Melbourne. You probably heard, or Melbourne, as the Americans say. Their recent Labor Party has won, I think, a fourth term or a third term. But basically, the premier there, or whatever the equivalent is in America, is basically one of his pledges is to make the electricity sector public again after a number of years. So it was privatized for, I'm not too sure how many years, for a very long time. And essentially after the recent developments globally and energy prices going through the roof, they recognize, well, we're going to make it public and, reduce the prices. And to me, at the time, I mean, I thought it was that's awesome. I mean, make things cheaper for people. But I mean, working it through the lens of your book, to me, this seems like an incredibly successful solution because it is appealing not only to professional classes, but more importantly to the working classes, where ultimately where political power is held, as I see it. And you probably agree. Agriculture I wonder what you think about decentralizing solutions. So there's one solution which I've come across through reading on sustainability is regenerative agriculture,
Mhm.
whereby you basically dismantle this idea that you have huge factory farms, huge industrial scale farms, and instead give power to the people to basically regenerate agriculture, soil,
Mhm.
wildlife on much smaller scale farms. And not only is that ecologically friendly, but you're also, I guess, giving power back to the people. What do you think of those sort of decentralizing solutions for agriculture specifically?
Yeah, so I actually live on a farm. My wife runs a small organic farm, and so
Oh, that's great.
she she tries to say that she just loves the work of it and is not trying to advance any kind of political agenda, but she gets sort of roped into this kind of
Mm, mm,
very local agricultural organic foodie type of networks. And um I you know I think there's a lot we can do to agriculture that can really make it more sustainable. And I'm maybe because I'm so embedded in the kind of professional class, typical environmental leftist, I've become allergic to the kind of sort of focus on decentralization and localism, um, because I do think, at least for the climate, it's such a massive, huge problem, and we need kind of big solutions, right? And I've been citing there's a famous political theorist named Jody Dean who had this quote that Goldman Sachs doesn't care if you raise chickens. And it's this sort of dig at like a lot of like local, sometimes, like anarchist solutions where we're
mm,
just going to
mm,
like have urban gardens and we're going to grow our own food. Well, like that is kind of fun and fulfilling. Like, again, my wife loves this work and it's community building. It's all this great stuff, but what does it do to actually challenge the power of those who are churning
mm,
away and then in the corporate agricultural sector and just like maintaining their power? I think we have to think about that.
mm,
But to be honest, like what you just mapped out for a politics of public power and public electricity, and recognizing that this sector and this commodity, if you will, is too important to people's lives to be left to the market, right? To be left to
mm,
the anarchic volatility of price spikes and gouges. So we really need to take control over this sector to subject it to more rational planning and,
mm,
again, cheaper provision for the working class. I think that is a model that unfortunately isn't really entertained in the
mm,
food sector and agriculture. We just sort of accept that, of course, food's a commodity. In the US, we try to say healthcare is a human right, but no one ever says that for food for some reason. But I
mm,
think trying to come up with maybe a mixture of yes, decentralized local vegetable
mm,
production with, I would say,
mm,
we actually are going to need like large scale, I would even say industrial, like grain
mm.
production, because the basis of any food system is actually the grains you're producing. Like
Yeah.
the staple crops, like those are really like the foundation. And
Mm,
so if you could conduct that kind of production under public ownership and public purpose, to where the goal is to decarbonize it and provision it cheaper to the
mm,
workers, like that's like a model that I would be interested in exploring. Unfortunately,
mm,
like that our agricultural sector is just so thoroughly capitalist and so controlled by
mm,
these massive corporations. It's hard to imagine getting there, but that's the kind of model I'd like to
mm.
move toward or think toward in the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even when when you were talking about making food a human right, I was thinking of Michael Pollan's book. I forget which the name of the title, but it's essentially focusing on the philosophy of food and eating and the history of eating, which sounds doesn't sound particularly interesting at first, but uh, what I, as someone that loves cooking and someone that is very intimately tied to food, and how it's very intimately tied to my historical legacy of my immigrant parents,
Mm.
and then those recipes are descended from their parents. to me, cooking is a very important experience. But what I thought was interesting from Michael Pollan's book is he talks about how in the 60s, as the liberation of women's movement was happening and cooking became an equal role, for corporations, particularly fast food corporations, stepped in and filled the niche of well, you're both busy, so why don't you just order food from us and help us make money? Which I thought was quite interesting and sort of taking away, maybe not taking away, but adding in some degrees, also taking power away from people to have nutritious food and all those sorts of things. Anyway, that's sort of a strange tangent I didn't expect to take, but yeah, I am. I'm very hopeful for the future, but also a lot of work is to be done. And to quote another academic, Simon Michaud, who's he does geology at this University of Finland, I think, or university. He says that the coming generation of people will have to be stronger, or as strong, if not stronger, than the soldiers in World War II. In the sense of that is how much political will, that is how much mental strength that we'll need to sort of combat climate, given how it's so entrenched in capitalism. And as a sort of final point, I wanted to touch on degrowth briefly. So I've been recently exposed to the cult of degrowth. No, I'm joking. But when I first came across it, I was like, wow, this is awesome. And I sort of still feel that way, mainly because I think there's such a big appetite for alternative economic models. So much so, especially in the age of climate, I think a lot of, especially professional class people, are probably starting to feel, oh, this is not great, and especially working class people. But like you said sort of earlier, that you hinted, is that a lot of degrowth, at least a lot of the meta messages or the bigger messages sort of that come out of the movement is oriented around, I guess, anti-consumerism thought. And when I first heard of the term and read Jason Hickel's book, Less is More, which I highly recommend you read if you haven't read it. How I sort of organized my thoughts was sort of seeing it as like minimalism, but in a political sense. And so to your point of it focusing on consumerism, I would definitely agree with you. However, I wanted to touch on, slightly push back on one of the arguments you've made, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I want to make sure I understand you correctly. So I think one of the arguments you made is that in moments where degrowth focuses on the rich, it seems to focus on the politics of less rather than focusing on solutions, and solutions from individuals rather than focusing on collective action. Is that sort of, would you say, is an argument you would make?
I think that degrowthers have been pretty good about, fighting for what they often call universal public services. So, and I think some of them have had very good critiques of kind of individualism, of individualist environmental politics, about thinking we can only affect things as our role as consumers. So yeah, I think they're very articulating a kind of collective approach. One of my issues is that, again, and I'll sound again, my allergy comes into play. If you look at like the solutions that they often offer, they are these very niche, small scale. What the new book that I have read called The Future is Degrowth, they call them now-topias, which again are like urban gardens and communal kitchens and little small scale chicken raising operations that are, again, extremely gratifying to be a part of and community building. But the real question in my book is about power, and how are we going to build power? I recently read a piece by Georges Callas, and I forget the author, but it's just called Degrowth in the State. And it just sort of, the article starts off by saying like, well, degrowthers haven't really paid much attention to the state. And so this question of the state and state power and how we're going to win state power and harness state power is something, to be honest, and they admit this in the article, a lot of degrowth literature and political thinking comes out of the tradition of anarchism, which, if you're in that tradition, you don't want to think about the state. You think the state is the problem and you're very much against the state. I come from a position that not only I come from a Marxist politics that thinks we have to think about seizing state power to accomplish what we want to for our goals, but also from a non-Marxist climate position, I find it very hard to understand how we're going to achieve the speed and scale of decarbonization without harnessing the power of the state. Because it seems like, when we talk about a Green New Deal, we're actually hearkening back to the New Deal, which was this incredible harnessing of state public investment and building. And a lot of what they did was build huge amounts of electricity. They built dams and hydroelectric power to deliver it to rural, poor areas, which the private utilities had deemed not really profitable to serve. So I actually, I just come from a perspective that we need to think about state power. We need to think about power in a broader sense, and I don't see that kind of thinking in terms of like collective action from degrowth perspective. And the basis of my critique is much like the rest of the part on the professional class, is like these people really offer a really appealing politics to the already converted professional, highly educated, climate aware people. And so if you are in that space, you find, like you were saying, you find degrowth politics is awesome. It's saying everything you think already, and it really resonates. And if you look at the people who are advocating degrowth, they're not just university educated. They often have PhDs. They often are either on their way to getting PhDs. So it's an extremely narrow group of people who really love this framework. And it's becoming more influential in the media, and because the media is itself run by professionals. So but I think if you're talking to ordinary working class people who are dealing with those end of month struggles, and the people are like, we're gonna degrow the economy.
Yeah, we're gonna cut the work week by 3 days.
Well, that I think has always been a working class demand, and that appeals. Shortening the work week, that's great. But if you say we're going to reduce everyone's energy consumption in the global north, which is what they often say, for people that are struggling to pay their heating bill and figuring out, like, are we going to pay the heat this month or pay the rent, like that doesn't necessarily resonate. I think again, this focus on, one of the degrowth slogans is we need to live better with less, right? I think that appeals to a professional class that has enough, that's comfortable, that is anxious about the stuff they already have and wants to think about how to reduce it and downsize it. But for the masses, people are struggling with not enough, and they need. I think we need to have a politics that's clearly about what you have to gain, what you're going to win, and what more you get from this kind of politics. And that's where I think there's some sort of, some somewhat rhetorical messaging problems that I think that degrowth has.
Yeah, I definitely see what you mean by rhetorical, just in the very taking what perhaps what I understand to be a Marxist lens based on this conversation, is that if you're not focusing on where people's incomes are coming from, or if you're not focusing on the power that is held by capital, ultimately climate change will continue to be a problem. And so it is a matter of focusing on how to sort of, I'm sort of cautious of using the word dismantle because it sounds a bit revolutionary, but maybe it's apt, but focusing on shifting away, and perhaps, as you said, looking at solutions that are involving the state, such as making electricity public in order to solve climate. I'm actually interviewing the author next week, so I'd love to. I'll correspond with you over email, but I'd love to get any questions that you have for the future is degrowth for the author, because I want to pose some challenges, because I feel like I've been enjoying the learning about it, but perhaps not challenging it enough. So anyways, that's a side tangent. But to wrap up, Professor, I wanted to ask you about utopias. So the name of our podcast is called Utopias Now. And we ask all of our guests the question of, what would your utopia look like? And this can be in as few words or as many words as you like, but really it's an exercise of I guess, imagination and understanding. What I find quite fascinating about the question is it really illuminates the values of our guests in a very vivid way. But yeah, I wanted to ask you, Professor, what does your utopia look like?
So my one of my, and not to beat a dead horse as it were, but one of my problems is I think degrowth people misidentify the real problem ecologically with our economy as one of growth, when I actually think it's one of control. The problem is that the people that control our economy, that have the power to decide how our economy runs and what resources run into it and what energy we use, it's their power and control that's really limiting us from having a sustainable economy. And so my utopia is one in which the economy is actually democratized, and the majority of people democratically run the economy collectively and try to plan the economy for human needs, and I would add ecological sustainability. And that I would suggest that as from a Marxist point of view, if we were able to wrestle that control over the economy in the interest of the majority, we would first want to, just from a standard point of view, like abolish poverty and make sure everyone has enough to live the basics of life. And so food and modern sanitation services, electricity, like these things should be universal human rights. And but also that people are able to participate in the governance of this economy and sort of collectively decide and plan for how much energy do we actually need. So rather than just saying we need to consume less energy in the global north, full stop, we actually should debate democratically, like, what is a good life? How much energy do we need really? And what would it take to produce the type of good life that everyone deserves on this planet? And then of course, how do we do that, produce that while respecting the ecological systems that we all depend on, and also the various still existing peasant and indigenous communities that want to retain a certain local relationship with land and with a livelihood that would not necessarily want to be part of a sort of large scale planning for society. So sort of rambling, but yeah, basically my utopia is sort of democratizing economic life.
Well, I think that's a great way to wrap everything up. I will speak with you just after recording, Professor, but thank you very much for joining me. And if people want to have a look look at your book or want to find it anywhere, where can they find it? And if you'd like to promote any of your work, please feel free to do so.
If you just Google climate change as class war, it's just class war, not warfare, just little correction. But if you Google Verso climate change as class war, it should come right up. And I have a website under Syracuse University, the Maxwell School, where all my publications are there. If anything is paywalled, just email me and I'll send you a PDF. And unfortunately, I'm on Twitter at Matt Huber78. So.
Well, thank you very much, Professor, for joining me today. It's been a pleasure, and look forward to a conversation in the futures. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.